All right, is it the greatest football program in the history of college football? Well, that's a debate for another day, but we know it's at the top rung. It's on the Mount Rushmore. Talking Alabama football with Ben George of Tide 99.1. We're doing a series here on Mark Rogers TV looking at the best wins in the history of the program, the worst losses in the history of the program, and usually confining that down to the blogger's preference on whether they want to focus on their lifetime of watching college football. So we bring Ben in. It's one man's perspective, but it's a very special and insightful perspective. Ben, thanks so much for joining us.
Just kind of wondering what you meant by special, Mark, but we won't get into that. We'll just move forward.
Special. Think about what special meant when you were a little kid.
I don't know
Don't
if that's
overthink
good.
it.
I wonder if that's good special or bad special, but that's fine.
It's a good special, or we would not have you on. So
All right.
we got the historian here, who I think you're going to keep it to a limited time frame in recent history here.
Yeah, I'd rather speak on experience rather than Alabama's had a lot of great wins in the program's history, but I'd rather go on experience rather than what I've read or what highlights I've seen. It's easier to speak on those games, and it means a little more to me.
All right, let's knock it out here, Ben. What do you think when you think Alabama football, when you think back, and what puts a smile on your face is, man, that was sweet?
Well, I mean, I think the obvious games you first start with are the BCS championship games. Those are the ones that have the memories that last the longest. Those are the ones that mean the most, quite frankly. So they have to be towards the top of the list. I'll say my number one, undisputed number one game to the end of this, but it's not a BCS championship game. So in the order of the BCS championship games, for me, I think 92 was number one. Alabama was underappreciated all year long. We know the history of Miami. That team's been well documented. Their antics, their ego, and what we would call swagger now. I don't think swagger was around. That word was around back in the early '90s. But they came in and they got shut down. The Heisman Trophy quarterback Gino Torretta. That was an all-around remarkable game to watch. That was one of my earlier memories of Alabama football. After that, I'd probably go 2011 BCS championship game, Alabama-LSU, the rematch of that 6-3 ball game. I think everything around the game was incredible. It being in New Orleans was real special. Having both teams in the SEC, your first conference clash for a championship. And then Alabama went out and took care of business, and I think that was one of Nick Saban's best teams. I think most players on that team would tell you they thought they should have won that LSU game in the regular season, and had they won that game and went on to win the championship, they'd probably be considered the best team of Nick Saban's era. But they did have the one blemish. So that would be number two. Then number three would be 2009 Texas, the championship game out at the Rose Bowl, the one that kind of put Alabama back on the map from national perspective. Nick Saban's first at Alabama, and one that the only one that was undefeated. So that was a pretty special one indeed. And then the last one would be Notre Dame. Not much of a game. I think we both knew, and most fans weren't expecting a whole lot of that game. But it was great from a tradition standpoint. Obviously, having the two teams with that much history playing that game was pretty cool.
If I'm not mistaken, Notre Dame had Alabama's number from a historical standpoint. They had always beaten Alabama, or had only lost a couple times.
They have a pretty substantial winning record. They hadn't played a ton of times, but they do have I think Alabama beat them once prior.
Yeah, I think we all knew, like you say, that Alabama was the much better football team, that Notre Dame had a decent run, they had a strong defense, whatever, but didn't necessarily belong there. But it was kind of magical to see Alabama-Notre Dame on the marquee, and let's see what happens. Well, midway through the first quarter.
Remember, Mark, that Notre Dame team was, or maybe not the team as much as the fans were extremely, extremely cocky going into that game.
Oh, they were.
Which made it a lot better. Oh, yeah. Are you kidding me? A team that was so thirsty for wins and any kind of positive note on the football field, they went into that game thinking they had the better team, or at least the SEC. Oh, you guys are a little bit overrated. We're not buying into it. Notre Dame can play with you man for man, and they were pretty arrogant before the game, no question.
I understand having confidence in your team. I got no problem with that, but you look at the SEC's track record at that point, you look at Alabama's track record building up 2 championships in the previous 3 years, and then you also look at the way Notre Dame was winning games against marginal teams. They slipped by like 8 teams on their schedule. I just didn't see where the overconfidence was for the knowledgeable fan, but that probably speaks to the knowledge of the fan base in general. The LSU game, wasn't much of a game to watch. I thought it was going to be a great football game considering what happened in Tuscaloosa. It was inevitable that there would be more points on the board. Les Miles completely outcoached by Nick Saban, and Saban with that kind of time to prepare and knowing the opponent that well, I think it really was on display in New Orleans that night. Yeah, you bring up the Texas Rose Bowl game at the Rose Bowl for the championship. What had to be kind of, it's easy to look back and say, okay, Alabama was, I'm not going to say substantially better, but there was a bit of a gap between the two teams. Texas was very good. Wish I would have seen Colt McCoy play in the game. I don't know that it would have mattered, but it turned into a pretty tight game in the fourth quarter. I think 24-21. Texas made a bit of a comeback, and it was on edge there early in the fourth quarter. But it was the emergence of Nick Saban as a great coach at the University of Alabama, and they were removed about 17 years from the previous championship. So yeah, it was not a given at the point like it looks like now that they were going to win that game over Texas. They were a 3 to 4 or 5 point favorite at that point.
Yeah, and that Texas team was pretty good. And that was another one kind of along the same lines as Notre Dame. Alabama hadn't beaten Texas before, so that was kind of a part of that game that was pretty special too, to be able to erase that bit of history as well, and to win a championship and complete an undefeated season, because we've seen how difficult an undefeated season is to accomplish in college football now. For them to do it that year was pretty cool.
Now, the Miami game, you brought that one up. That was amazing in the sense that there was something magical about the setting or the kind of the aura of the two teams. We know about Miami. Alabama, extremely conservative, staunch, traditional football power, reemerging at that point. Had not been really down, but had not been vying for a national title for the previous 12 to 13 years, something in that range. And then they were a huge underdog. I think they were a 12 or 13 point underdog, if I remember correctly. And Miami had the flash. Everybody thought that their speed, their receiving ability on the outside, the passing game would be too much for Alabama. The Tide had those 2 defensive ends, Copeland and Curry, who just made life miserable for Gino Torretta. Antonio Langham at corner. Did Langham make the play downfield on the strip, or was that somebody else? I think that was somebody else.
That was George Teague.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. So that was just a memorable play and a big upset that I wasn't necessarily that surprised in watching Alabama play very solid football, fundamental football all season. But maybe that was one of my first great upset picks there, Ben.
And you mentioned the George Teague play. Some people probably don't realize that was the best non-play in college football history, because Alabama had jumped off sides on that play. Miami goes down the sideline. Lamar Thomas is gone. The guy said he was the fastest player in football. Maybe he might have said the world. Who knows? Guy was an arrogant guy. And then George Teague walks him down, strips the ball, and then the ball goes right back to Miami, 80 yards back down the field. It's replaying the down essentially. So that was a play that really never even happened. As far as we're concerned, from a play-by-play perspective, it was just a penalty, a 5-yard penalty on Alabama, but one of the great plays of all time.
Wow, you just educated me, because I just assumed that play meant a whole lot. Well, it negated the big long play, right?
Yeah, it saved a touchdown. So
yeah, it saved a touchdown. There you go. And then I'm going to take you back to the Penn State game. That you still see from time to time. I'm sure you do, especially in your part of the nation. You see from time to time the goal line stand against Penn State. Penn State and Alabama then in the 80s played, I just looked it up, 8 consecutive years and had a great rivalry. Unlike anything we've really ever seen in the history of college football between two major Titan programs like that, to play that many times consecutively. But in the 79 season 1980 Sugar Bowl, or it was the season before. I think it was the 78 season, the 79 Sugar Bowl. Yeah, Penn State, Joe Paterno looking to score the touchdown that would tie the game, and possibly, I think both teams were undefeated, 1 and 2 in the country. Alabama makes the amazing stand at the goal line on an NFL running back, Matt Suhey, for Penn State, who played with the Chicago Bears. And that was the stand there. The next season, Alabama won another national title, defeating Arkansas in the Sugar Bowl with Lou Holtz on the sideline in that one.
Yeah, you can go back over a number of those national championships that year, but those Penn State series were really good because they were very similar teams. You know, they played very similar football, so they were always lower scoring and tight. And there were some really good ones. I think Alabama blocked a field goal to win one. But those were the two programs that respected each other. We've seen that even in the recent series they played, but those were some pretty good ones.
All right, Ben. What else makes the cut? The Iron Bowl. Got to have some other some SEC title games.
You know, it's weird going through the Iron Bowl. You know, thinking about it, most of the Iron Bowls have been games that the favorites won. There's been some good games, you know, but for the most part, the favorites have won, and a lot of the ones that Alabama have won have been of the blowout variety, or at least of a couple scores. So they haven't been really exciting games, at least in the fourth quarter. A couple that stand out. 2001 was first year Alabama won down in Auburn ever. It was a blowout, 31-7. Your boy Coach Fran was on the sidelines for that game. But that was one where Alabama went in, you know, is expected to be a tight game, and they just it's like everything clicked that one game, and they had gotten tired of all the talk about Alabama not being able to win down in Auburn. And they shut it down pretty quickly in that game. Got out to a quick play. Andrews out of Jason McCadley was a big one. Santonio Beard ran wild on Auburn's defense that game. So that would be one that I'd have probably near the top. And so we talked about the 2009 Iron Bowl. That was a pretty big one as Alabama was finishing up that finish of the regular season undefeated, getting ready for that SEC championship game. They were on the ropes, and Julio Jones, who was one of the best players Alabama's had in the last 20 years or so, and probably all time when we go look back on it down the road. But you know, they went to him. They kept feeding him Greg McElroy to Julio that final drive, and then Greg McElroy rolled out to find Roy Upchurch in the end zone for the touchdown. That was probably one of the other biggest ones, I'd say, from the Iron Bowl. Those are the two that really stick out recently.
You know, we've talked the last couple of years about Texas A&M because of Johnny Manziel emerging as a rival to Alabama because of what happened when Bama was undefeated, still went to the national title game and won a couple of years ago, and then they get the revenge at Kyle Field last year. It was almost the same thing with Florida and Alabama in the early 90s. They emerged at the same time. Alabama back on the scene as a national power. Florida emerging for the first time basically under Steve Spurrier as a national power. Of course, played the first 92, 93, 94, first 3 SEC championship games, and the first one was monumental, winning that game over Florida to set up that first championship run against Miami in the Sugar Bowl, and that was a very close game. And we bring up Antonio Langham, who of course had the play of the game, the pick 6 for the touchdown, and they beat Florida by a touchdown in that game.
Yeah, that would probably be one of my biggest SEC championship games. That was the one, you know, that as we've seen the documentary on it now. You know, the ESPN documentary, 30 for 30 on that game, the play that changed the course of college football essentially, with Langham picking that off, because Roy Kramer, the former SEC commissioner, talks about it. You know, it was his idea to have this game, and you know, while it's changed the face of football now, if Langham doesn't make that play and Alabama doesn't go to the national championship game, he realizes he just cost his conference a national championship appearance. And that would have changed everything. Everybody would look down on that idea. What a stupid idea. You're costing your conference, you know, yada, yada, yada. But it did prove to be high drama, high stakes, and Alabama answered the bell and made that national championship even that much more special.
I thought it was a great idea. Of course, I didn't care who won the game. I didn't care if an SEC team was in the championship game. Didn't care anything about that. I just thought it was cool. I thought they got a conference. They got 2 divisions. They're decided to play a championship game. That's the way it should be. They've done the right thing. They're ahead of the curve, and maybe some other conferences will follow suit, which, of course, they did.
You want a couple regular season games?
Yeah.
Okay, a couple regular season games, something to get overlooked, and these are a couple that I think are pretty special, especially for Saban. I think one this one might not be on a lot of people's radar, but Clemson in 2008, the open of the season. Clemson was a top 10 team. Didn't turn out to be, but Alabama went in, and that was kind of the game that said, hey, this program should be back on the map and could be competing for championships pretty soon. Now, most people didn't think they would have been in the SEC championship that year in 2008 like they did, but it kind of set the table, and I think gave that team a lot of confidence coming off a pretty average year where they finished 500 in the regular season of the year before. So that was a good one. The other one that was really, really big for Alabama was 2008. Later that year was the Georgia game in Athens, what we call the blackout in Tuscaloosa. Georgia, we've seen them with expectations for much of the past decade, so that's not much different. But they thought that was the year that they had a really legitimate shot at competing for a championship, a national championship. Alabama went in there, dominated from the jump. Georgia made it closer later. Alabama had gotten conservative a bit, but they won that game comfortably, and that was the one that kind of sprung them right up to the top, right in the conversation, the national championship, because they were right on the outside of the top 5 or 6 at that point. That sprung them into the top 3, I think, and from there we saw what happened with that program.
The two games that come to mind for me, not regular season or BCS championship games, but SEC title games, which we talked about the importance of those, and I think it's just a really cool thing, conference title games. The 2009 game against Florida, because you had the two distinguished programs at that point that had separated themselves from the rest of the nation. And of course, Florida won 2 national championships under Urban Meyer. Saban was on his way to breaking through, and of course did in 2009 against Florida. Then the 2012 game, which Georgia proved to be a very formidable opponent, probably the second best team in the country. Aaron Murray taking it down the field and almost getting it into the end zone, but Alabama holds and goes on to another BCS title game.
Yeah, those would be the Georgia game. I overlooked a bit before this conversation, but that one was a big one. I mean, that was huge. And a lot of look, honestly, and this might sound a bit biased towards the SEC. I know you probably expect that, but it's honest when I say that I think the SEC championship game has meant more to SEC teams over the course of that 7-year run. I mean, that game a lot of times was the winner is probably going to be the national champion. Whether or not other conferences or other fans want to believe that, when you're a fan of the SEC and you see what they're going through every week, you knew, especially in that Alabama-Georgia game, I mean, there was no question the winner of that game coming out of that was going to be Notre Dame for the national championship game. We saw how it played out. And then but the 2009 SEC championship game, my undisputed number 1 game for Alabama as far as wins are concerned. Couple reasons. Alabama, we saw them kind of building towards that crescendo that year. That we thought they got a pretty good chance, but Florida's still the top dog in the SEC. They knocked Alabama off the year before. They were a pretty untouchable program at that point under Urban Meyer. Alabama had built up the entire offseason and went into that year penciling that game in. They still had a lot to go through in that 2009 season to get there. Almost lost to Tennessee and Lane Kiffin. Almost lost in that Iron Bowl we talked about. Well, they got to that SEC championship game, and it was like a team possessed. I mean, they shut down everything Tebow tried to do. This was his last year. I mean, this was Tim Tebow at his best. I mean, he had built to this point as well, and they shut him down. Everything hit, and you knew when they won that SEC championship game, which it's still been a long time since they had won one of those, that you knew, okay, this is kind of the moment. And when I talk to friends, when I talk to people that had been to that game, that SEC championship game, in that 2009 season, I think a strong majority of people will tell you that game was the best game from that season. That you don't really overlook the national championship game because it is the championship game, but everybody knew that was the de facto championship that year. Those were the 2 best teams, the 2 best programs at that time. They were duking it out, and it was a game for the ages. But Alabama took care of business, and then of course Tim Tebow cried. Right? Remember that?
Well, it was a great game. It wasn't a great game from the standpoint of watching a close game because Alabama, really laid down the throttle. I think it was a close game for 3 quarters, then they took over in the 4th quarter. But I'm not going to comment on Tebow. I didn't take the bait there. But yeah, Florida was it. 2 national titles in the previous 3 seasons. Coming down the stretch, it looked like they were better than Alabama. They had beaten them, the year before in a very tight game that I was a bit surprised that it was that close because I thought the Gators were substantially better, but Bama gave them a fight to the end. And then, it looks like Tebow's going to crown this incredible career, which it still was, but maybe distinguish himself as some people were saying, hey, this guy's going to win a Heisman, win another national title, which the first one he won as the backup quarterback, but still was a major factor in the offense. Could have 3 national titles. He could distinguish himself as like the greatest player or greatest quarterback in terms of accolades in the history of college football. And Alabama put down the throttle in the 4th quarter and completely changed, in a sense, the landscape of the conference. Who knows what would have happened had that Florida team won again and Urban Meyer continued to coach at Florida, maybe.
Yeah, that was the thing. That was the passing of the torch in the SEC. It went from Florida being the #1 team to Alabama, and essentially it put all the power back in the West as well. But not even that. Urban Meyer, whether or not we blame that game for it, he had the health issues afterwards, right? And he left the SEC and made his move out of football for his family, Mark. He made the move for his family.
Here we go.
Took the year off before heading to Ohio State.
We're changing the focus of the video here, Ben. Let's stick to the euphoria of the great Alabama wins, which I think we've touched upon. I don't think you have anything else to add. Of course, if you do, the stage is yours.
No, I think that list pretty much covers it all for me.
Okay, like we talked about before we went on, now we get down to the losses, and this is where it gets a little bitter, a little serious, because if you're an Alabama football fan, you look at the schedule and you check off the wins, and maybe you've got a little concern about twice a season, but pretty much you're checking off wins, just waiting for particular games. And you talk about losses, losing at Alabama or a school of that ilk, and they sting for a long, long time. So we'll bring Ben right back. We'll talk about the worst losses since he's been an Alabama fan. And, of course, we invite you to make your comments as well.